The history books often tell us that England fell in a single afternoon. They paint a picture of a battle, a single arrow, a king dead on a hillside, and then the doors of history slam shut. The Anglo-Saxons are erased, the Normans rise, and the story moves on. But that is not how it felt to the person who lived it. For the villager in a remote corner of Wessex, or the farmer in the green hills of Northumbria, the conquest was not a door slamming shut, it was a slow, agonizing unravelling of a world they had spent centuries building. Imagine waking up one morning in a country, a country of ancient laws, familiar rhythms, and a language that feels like your own heart. And then slowly, over the passing of months and years, that country begins to fade, replaced by something foreign, cold, and entirely indifferent to your existence. This is not a story of kings and crowns. This is a story of how a sophisticated, prosperous kingdom was dismantled, field by field, village by village, until an entire population found themselves strangers in their own land. We are standing on the morning of October 14th, 1066. Behind us lies a society that had already mastered the art of governance, a land of sophisticated tax systems, thriving trade routes, and monasteries filled with the wisdom of centuries. Ahead of us lies the silence of a transition so absolute that within a generation, the people who had built this land would be rendered powerless. Tonight we aren't just looking at the Battle of Hastings, we are looking at what happened in the days, weeks, and years that followed. We are going to step inside the homes of those who survived the fire, who watched the castles rise above their fields, and who had to learn, under the shadow of a foreign lord, what it meant to endure when everything you held dear was being systematically erased. This is the story of 1066, not as a date, but as a lived experience. The channel Sleepy History with Kevin is a storytelling platform created for entertainment, inspiration, education, and the promotion of positive emotional values. To understand the scale of what was lost, we must look at the England that William the Conqueror invaded. The popular image of Anglo-Saxon England as a dark, disorganized and primitive fog is one of history's most enduring myths. In reality, on the eve of the invasion, England was arguably the most effectively governed kingdom in northern Europe. Think of the country's infrastructure. It was not a loose collection of tribes, but a nation with a national tax system, the Geld, capable of assessing and collecting revenue across the entire realm, with a precision that would baffle many contemporary leaders. They had a centralized currency, regulated and monitored to prevent debasement, ensuring that a coin minted in York held the same weight and value as one used in the bustling markets of London. The social fabric was just as advanced. The land was divided into shires, each with its own administrative court and sheriff, serving as the connective tissue between the king's vision and the village reality. Every hundred, the subdivision of the shire had its own assembly, ensuring that even in local matters there was a sense of order, law, and shared responsibility. And then there was the beauty. If you were to walk into a monastery in the 1060s, you would find libraries filled with books, illuminated by monks whose skill was unparalleled. The craftsmanship was famous across the entire continent. English needlework, for instance, was so exquisite that it was simply known as opus anglicum. English work, a status symbol so prestigious that no further description was needed in the royal courts of Europe. The towns were vibrant centres of commerce. London was a hub of trade, teeming with merchants. Winchester served as the intellectual and royal heart of the kingdom, and York was a glittering cosmopolitan nexus of the Viking world. Along the Roman roads, a network of commerce carried wool, grain, leather and tin, powered by a merchant class that thrived on the stability the English kings had provided for generations. This was a society defined by a deeply poetic and resilient language, Old English. It was a Germanic tongue, flexible, rich, and capable of holding the epic gravitas of Beowulf, the administrative precision of the Anglo-Saxon chronicle, and the profound intimacy of personal prayer. It was not the language of a primitive people, it was the language of a nation that believed in its own identity, its own law, and its own right to exist. This was the country Harold Godwinson marched to defend. It was a country that by the standards of the medieval world was not just functioning, it was thriving, and yet this was the world that stood on the precipice of total erasure. The morning of October 14th began with the certainty of 1,000 years of tradition. On the ridge near Hastings, Harold Godwinson's army stood firm, a living wall of shields reflecting the pale autumn sun. For hours the rhythm of the defence held. They were a cohesive unit, bonded by duty to their king and their soil. But as the sun began to dip toward the horizon, the impossible happened. The shield wall, which had seemed like a permanent feature of the English landscape, was broken. When the news reached the villages of the south, the news that the king was dead, his brothers fallen, and the core of the English aristocracy lying silent upon the hillside, the reaction was not a sudden explosion of chaos, it was a cold, creeping realization of abandonment. The men who had governed the shires, who had led the armies, and who had acted as the final arbiters of justice for their people, were gone. In one afternoon the backbone of the nation had been severed. William did not rush into the vacuum. He was a man of cold, deliberate calculation. He chose to wait, to circle, to burn through the towns of Kent, Surrey, and Hertfordshire. This was not merely a military manoeuvre, it was a psychological dismantling. By leaving a trail of destruction that felt intentional and systemic, he was sending a message to every village he passed. The old order is not just defeated, it is dead. By Christmas Day 1066, the crowning ceremony at Westminster Abbey was a grim reflection of this new reality. Conducted in a language that the English people did not understand, Latin and French, it took place amidst the smoke of burning buildings. The guards, panicked by the shouting of the congregation, had set fire to the surroundings. The new king was crowned in a city that was literally suffocating. It was a perfect dark metaphor for what was to come. For the ordinary people, the coronation was not a celebration. It was the formal announcement that their world had been signed over to a foreign master. The land still looked the same. The fields were still waiting for the plough, but the person who owned it all, the person who held the power to decide who lived in comfort and who lived in hunger, was now a man who could not and would not speak their language. For the ordinary villagers in the southern shires, the weeks following the coronation were defined by a profound sense of bewilderment. In the communities directly along the path of William's army, the reality was immediate and brutal. Barns were emptied, livestock driven off, and the harvest that had been carefully stored for the coming winter was seized. Families who had spent months preparing for the cold found themselves staring at empty granaries. Yet for the villages further removed from the marching path of the Norman soldiers, the change was slower, stranger, and perhaps more disorienting. Life did not simply stop. The rhythm of the survival remained stubborn. The animals still needed to be fed, the bread still had to be baked, and the fields still required tending. These daily cycles do not pause for political conquest, and this persistence of the mundane made the encroaching occupation feel like a phantom, slowly taking shape. The most intimate change was the disappearance of the local lord. In village after village, the man who had been a fixture of the community, a man whose family had been known to the people for generations, was gone. Sometimes he had fallen in battle. Sometimes he had been dispossessed, his land stripped from him and handed to a Norman knight. Occasionally he fled, joining the growing tide of English exiles seeking refuge in Scotland, Flanders, or as far away as Byzantium. In his place arrived a stranger. This new lord spoke a language that sounded like a jarring, unrecognizable melody to the villagers. He brought with him customs they had never seen and expectations they had no way to fulfill. He prayed in the same churches, yet the words he uttered were entirely foreign. The timber frame of the houses remained, the village lanes were still the same, and the church bell still rang at the same hour. But the man who sat in judgment, the man who decided how much grain a family could keep and how much they had to surrender, was now an outsider. He did not ask to be understood, he simply commanded. The villagers found themselves living in the same home they had occupied for a lifetime, yet feeling like refugees within their own fields. All stories on this channel, Sleepy History with Kevin, are fictional, thoughtfully crafted around historical themes and inspired by real events, figures, and periods, reimagined for engaging storytelling. The content does not represent real individuals, actual events, or documented cases. Any resemblance to real people, animals, or events is purely coincidental. The most visceral, immediate change to the English landscape was not a law or a decree, it was the arrival of the castle to the Anglo-Saxons. A lord lived among his people in a great hall, a building that, while grand, was open and accessible. It was a place of communal feasts, where the lines between the leader and the led were fluid and bridged by tradition. The Norman castle, by contrast, was an invention of profound isolation. Within a decade, hundreds of these structures were erected across England. They were not yet the towering stone keeps that define our modern romanticised vision of the Middle Ages. These early Motte and Bailey castles were crude, ugly, and terrifyingly efficient. A mound of earth, often heaped up by forced local labour, supported a wooden tower on top, protected by a fenced enclosure below. They were built in weeks, not years, and they were designed with one purpose in mind: to dominate the population that lived within their shadow. The peasants who built these castles were essentially constructing their own prisons. They dug the ditches and raised the mounds with their own hands under the supervision of soldiers who did not speak their language. They understood that the tower being raised above them was a place from which they would be watched, controlled, and, if necessary, punished. This changed the psychology of every community within sight of a castle. The Norman lord no longer lived within the community. He lived above it, literally and figuratively. He was visible but unreachable, hidden behind a palisade that served as a physical manifestation of his power. The message was clear without a single word being spoken. You are below, I am above. The distance between the ruling elite and the people was no longer measured in shared meals or mutual obligations, but in earth, timber, and the presence of armed men. If this kind of deep historical reconstruction is something you value, subscribing is the best way to make sure the next chapter of this journey reaches you. Every video takes weeks of research, writing, and production, and your subscription tells me that this work matters. If you have been watching this far, you already care about history done properly, and that means a lot to me. Now, with the castle standing sentinel over a changed landscape, let us look at how the basic rhythms of daily life, the harvest, the hearth, and the law, began to buckle under the new order. For the peasants, the conquest was not merely a shift in who wore the crown, it was a fundamental alteration of the physical reality of their daily lives. The Normans did not come to England to learn local farming techniques or to preserve the delicate balance of the village economy. They came to extract wealth, and they were, by every metric, ruthlessly efficient at it. In the old Anglo-Saxon system, the relationship between a lord and a peasant was guided by custom. Everyone knew what was owed: a certain portion of the harvest, a specific number of labour days on the lord's land, and traditional payments: a pig at Michaelmas, a measure of honey at midsummer, eggs at Easter. These agreements had evolved over generations. They were harsh in principle, perhaps, but they were flexible in practice and understood by both sides. There was a margin for survival. The Normans, however, did not respect this invisible code of custom. They did not know it, and they did not care to learn it. What they brought was a cold, systematic eye for assessment. They walked through the fields, counted the ploughs, measured the woodland, and calculated the livestock with a ledger-like detachment. They were looking for the maximum possible extraction. Almost overnight, the customary agreements were swept aside. New demands were imposed. Labour obligations were expanded and rents were increased. A family that had once produced just enough surplus to provide a safety net for the long winter found that the margin between survival and starvation was narrowing. Where there had once been a shared understanding of what the land could provide, there was now only the relentless pressure of a foreign lord demanding more. The village elders and the free farmers, who had once stood in the local courts to assert their customary rights, found that their voices carried no weight. The language of power had shifted. When they tried to appeal to the old ways, they were met with confusion or outright dismissal. The law had not changed on paper, but the people who enforced it had. For an English peasant, the most profound loss was not of the spirit or the crown, but of the certainty that their labour would yield enough to keep their children fed. The surplus was gone, and with it the quiet stability of the English countryside. The church was the one institution that should have remained a sanctuary of continuity, a bridge between the old world and the new. Both the English and the Normans were Christian, both attended Mass, revered the same saints, observed the fasts, and prayed to the same God. Yet William understood that the church was not just a house of prayer, it was an engine of power, and he treated it accordingly. Within a few years of the conquest, nearly every English bishop and abbot had been removed, replaced by Normans who viewed the English church as backward and in need of reform. Even the few English prelates who were permitted to remain lived under constant pressure and scrutiny. The new bishops were not necessarily men of malice. Some were genuine scholars and reformers, but they were to the people in the pews entirely foreign. For the peasant, the village church was the centre of existence. It was where they were baptized, where they were joined in marriage, and where they would eventually be buried. It was the only place to hear news from beyond the village borders, and the only source of reassurance that their suffering had meaning in the eyes of God. But the nature of that reassurance was changing. The services were still in Latin, they had always been. But the informal connection, the words of comfort a priest offered to a grieving mother or a dying man, had previously been spoken in English. Now, the new priests sent from Normandy did not speak the language of the people they served. To walk into your village church on a Sunday morning, to see a stranger at the altar dressed in unfamiliar vestments, and to hear prayers spoken in a tongue that was not your own, was a traumatic rupture. The bells still rang, the candles still burned, and the cross still stood above the door, but the intimate relationship between the community and the divine had been severed. The church was still there, but for the English, it felt as though the language of God had been replaced by the language of the conqueror. Of all the impositions of the new order, none was felt more bitterly or more daily than the forest laws. To William and his Norman elite, the hunt was not merely a pastime, it was a ritual of dominance and a raw statement of power. When the king claimed the forest, he was not just claiming trees, he was asserting that the very landscape itself, and everything within it, belonged to him. In Norman legal terminology, a royal forest did not mean a vast wilderness of trees. It was a legal designation that could swallow up entire villages, pastures, and fields of grain. Once a patch of land was declared part of the royal forest, it was removed from the common usage of the people who had lived there for generations. Suddenly, ancient paths were blocked, and ordinary activities, gathering firewood, letting pigs forage for acorns, or trapping a rabbit for the stew pot, were transformed into high crimes against the crown. The penalties were designed for one purpose: terror. If you were caught with a bow in the forest, you were assumed to be a poacher, and the consequences could be catastrophic. Blinding loss of a hand or brutal fines became the reality for those who simply tried to feed their families as they had always done. Even the animals themselves, the deer, the boar, seemed to gain more protection under the new law than the peasants who toiled beside them. This was a daily grinding humiliation. For a peasant, the forest had been an extension of the home, a source of life. Now it was a forbidden zone where every shadow held the threat of a warden's whip or the king's executioner. The land had become a cage, and the law was the key that the people were no longer allowed to hold. If you are finding these insights into the reality of 1066 compelling, please take a moment to subscribe and hit the notification bell. Supporting this channel allows me to continue these deep dives into the forgotten corners of our history, where the true stories of the past are hidden beneath the layers of time. Your engagement truly makes this project possible. Now, with the forests closed and the land surveyed, we must turn to the ultimate act of control, the systematic recording of every soul in the kingdom. In 1085, William ordered an undertaking that had no parallel in medieval Europe. He sent his commissioners into every shire, every hundred, and every village in the land. They were to record everything: who held the land, how much it was worth, how many plough teams were available, how many cattle, pigs and goats occupied the pastures, and, most importantly, what the land had been worth before the invasion compared to its value now. The result was the Domesday Book. The name itself tells us how the English felt about it. Doomsday, the day of judgment, when every secret is laid bare and nothing can be hidden. For the villagers, this was not a simple census, it was a terrifyingly thorough cataloguing of their existence. The commissioners travelled with a level of clinical precision that was utterly alien to the people being questioned. They held courts in every shire, summoned local juries, and cross-checked every answer with ruthless scrutiny. Nothing was too insignificant to be missed: a mill, a fish pond, or even a single beehive. For the English reeves and farmers who had to stand before these officials, the experience was profoundly humiliating. They were not being recorded as people or even as subjects, they were being tallied as assets. The Domesday Book does not list names of peasants, it lists numbers. It lists them as components of an estate's productive capacity. The purpose everyone knew was taxation. William was not interested in the well-being of his people, he was interested in the yield of his kingdom. Every plough team, every acre, every animal recorded was a line in a ledger that would dictate the future of their poverty. The Anglo-Saxon chronicle, written by monks who watched their world being dismantled, recorded the event with a bitterness that still resonates 9 centuries later. They wrote that it was a shame to record such things, but the king did not care about shame. He wanted to know the exact value of every man's labour, down to the last ox. It was a masterpiece of administration and a chilling testament to the efficiency of total power. The conquest created a fracture that ran deeper than the land itself. It split the very language of England. The Normans brought with them their own dialect, a version of French shaped by their Scandinavian origins and their time in northern France. This became the language of the court, the law, the church hierarchy, and every institution that held authority. English did not vanish. The peasants still spoke it in the fields, mothers used it to sing to their children, and the village priest, if he was one of the few who survived, might still use it to deliver his sermons, but it was no longer the language of power. It was effectively relegated to the status of a domestic hidden language. Imagine the frustration of an English-speaking peasant trying to plead his case in a memorial court, standing before a judge who could not understand a single word he uttered. The practical effect was a kind of societal silence. The English-speaking majority was effectively cut off from the mechanisms of governance. They could not read the charters that dictated their lives. They could not argue their rights in the language of the courtroom. This linguistic divide endured for centuries. When English finally re-emerged as the language of law and government, it was a transformed creature, a hybrid, scarred and enriched by the collision. Even today, when we use words like beef for the animal that was called a cow in the field, or justice instead of the older sense of fairness, we are hearing the echo of this ancient divide. The animal stayed English because the peasant tended it. The meat on the table took a French name because the Norman lord consumed it. If you're finding this reconstruction of a fractured society as thought-provoking as I do, please consider subscribing to the channel. Your support helps me bring these forgotten, complex chapters of history to life. What aspect of this cultural collision do you find most haunting? Let me know in the comments below. I read every one of them. Now, let us consider the long-term emotional toll of this era, and how a generation of people learned to live in the shadow of a system they knew would never leave. To live in a village in England in the 1070s and 1080s was to navigate a landscape defined by a new suffocating kind of fear. It was not the acute, jagged terror of the Viking raids that earlier generations had known. The Vikings were raiders. They came, they plundered, and they left, or in time they settled and became neighbours. The fear they inspired was a storm that eventually passed. The Normans were different. They did not leave. They were occupiers, and their presence was permanent, etched into the very soil by the castles they built. For the people of England, the fear was not of a sudden attack, but of a systemic existence. It was the fear of a machine that could take your land, increase your rent, demand your labour, and punish you for the simple act of gathering firewood. It was the knowledge that there was no after, there would be no liberation, no moment when the conquerors would sail away and the old world would return. At night, in the low light of the village homes, the conversation was no longer about whether the raiders would return. It was about whether the new lord would raise the rents again, whether the forest warden would find them for a stray trap, or whether the castle on the hill would demand another season of forced labour. The sounds of the night, the wind in the thatch, the distant bark of a fox remained the same, yet the world outside the door had fundamentally changed. There was a profound, quiet grief in this, a mourning for a world that had not been destroyed by the indifferent hand of nature or the whims of God, but by the calculated ambition of men. This content is inspired by and adapted from public domain works available through Project Gutenberg. The material has been transformed through original narration, editing, and storytelling to create a unique experience for educational and entertainment purposes. The Norman Conquest was not just a revolution in law and language, it was a revolution in the very landscape of England. If you were to walk through a shire in the late 11th century, the first thing that would strike you, the thing that would make you feel unmistakably that you were in a conquered land, was the stone. Before the Normans, England had built in wood, wattle and daub. Their churches were modest, intimate, and integrated into the daily life of the village. They were designed for proximity, for the small group of worshippers who gathered each Sunday to hear the gospel in a language that touched their hearts. But the Normans brought with them a different architecture, a different scale, and a different philosophy of faith and governance. Beginning in the decades after 1066, the skylines of England began to change. Massive, heavy, Romanesque cathedrals began to rise: Durham, Ely, Winchester, and a reconstructed Canterbury. These were not buildings designed for the comfort of the local parish, they were designed to dominate. They were statements of permanence, built of stone, hauled from across the kingdom, rising as mountains of masonry that dwarfed everything around them. To an English peasant who had grown up in a low-roofed timber house, these cathedrals were not just churches, they were manifestations of a divine power that felt inextricably linked to the power of the new Norman bishops and kings. These buildings were intentionally designed to look different from what had come before. They were thick-walled, imposing and rigid. When you stood before them, you were meant to feel small, you were meant to feel the gravity of the Norman presence. This was architecture as a psychological weapon, a way of signalling that the Old English style was obsolete and that a new, more rigid order had taken root. But consider the human cost of this architectural boom. These massive structures required tens of thousands of tons of stone, and an army of labourers to quarry, haul and lay it. Who do you think performed this labour? It was the English villagers, the same people whose fields were being taxed into exhaustion, whose forests were being closed off, and whose language was being stripped of its official status. They were forced to build the very monuments that were designed to overawe them and signify their subjugation. In the shadows of these rising cathedrals, the Old English identity began to feel like a fading ghost. The villagers would look up at the soaring arches and the high, stone-vaulted ceilings, realizing that their world had been reshaped by men who saw the land not as a home, but as a canvas for their own glory. The stones themselves seemed to scream that the conquest was permanent. There was no more before. There was only the looming, crushing now. The cathedrals stood as the new anchors of the English landscape, holding the conquered kingdom in place. A silent stone garrison for a foreign king who never saw his subjects as anything more than the hands that moved his rocks and the fields that fed his horses. This was the New England, a land of stone and shadow, where the monumentalism of the invaders constantly reminded the conquered of their diminished place in the grand Norman-led design. Yet amidst the crushing weight of the new stone cathedrals and the cold, systematic administration of the Domesday book, there was something the Normans could not reach. They could replace the lords, they could depose the bishops, and they could rewrite the language of the courtroom, but they could not replace the people who actually did the work. While the Norman elite were busy constructing their monuments to power and debating the finer points of land tenure in their foreign tongue, the real England continued to breathe in the rhythm of the seasons. The woman at the quern still ground the grain, even if she had to hide a portion of it to keep her family fed. The farmer still mended his fences in the grey light of dawn, knowing the land needed his touch to yield its harvest. The shepherd still sheared the sheep, and the weaver still threw the shuttle across the loom, producing the coarse woolen cloth that had clothed English backs for generations. These were the things that truly defined the country, and they remained untouched by the conquest. This was not a resistance of steel or arrows, it was a resistance of survival. It was a refusal to let the fundamental identity of the land die out, even as the surface of that land was being violently stripped away. Every time a mother taught her child an English folk song, or a farmer utilised an ancestral method of crop rotation that the Normans had never heard of, they were keeping the old world alive in the only way they could, through the continuity of their own existence. Think of the sheer, stubborn persistence required to simply keep living. To go out into the fields each morning, to tend to the animals, to harvest the barley and the oats, all while knowing that a significant portion of your hard-earned labour was being siphoned off to support a foreign lord in a wooden tower on a hill. That is a form of courage that historians rarely record. The Normans saw these people as mere assets in their tax ledgers, but in reality these were the true custodians of English culture. The Normans had the power to change the laws, but they lacked the knowledge to farm the land. They had the power to conquer the towns, but they lacked the skills to maintain the intricate, centuries-old social dynamics of the village. And so the English people became the silent, steady pulse of a country that was being rebuilt from the top down. They lived in the shadow of the new order, certainly, and they bore the scars of the conquest, but they did not disappear. They endured. They maintained the ancient cycle of the land, preserving the knowledge, the customs, and the spirit of a people who refused to be erased. This quiet, unremarkable persistence is perhaps the most impressive feat of the entire 11th century. It is the story of how an entire nation managed to keep its soul, even as the structures around it were being dismantled and replaced. They were the ones who carried the memory of England through the darkest of times, and it is their sweat, their labour and their stubbornness that ensured that when the dust finally settled, the country that remained was still, at its core, English. The people who lived through the initial shock of 1066 could never have imagined the world that would emerge from the wreckage. A woman baking bread in a Wessex village in the 1080s, looking out over a landscape dotted with wooden towers, had no way of knowing that she was witnessing the birth of a new civilization. The farmer in Yorkshire, rebuilding his life on the ashes of his former home, could not have foreseen that his great-grandchildren would speak a language that blended the words of his ancestors with those of his conquerors. They were trapped in the immediate, biting reality of their present, the daily struggle for survival and the heavy silence imposed by the new regime. Yet history is rarely a matter of simple replacement. It is almost always a matter of fusion. The conquest set in motion a process of integration that was as painful as it was inevitable. Over the following generations, the sharp edges of the Norman occupation began to soften, not because of a change of heart among the rulers, but because the two cultures were forced to inhabit the same geography, drink the same water, and rely on the same land. The language that eventually emerged from this collision, Middle English, was a living, breathing testament to this fusion. It was no longer the pure poetic tongue of Beowulf, nor was it the sterile legalistic French of the Norman courts. It was a messy, pragmatic, and remarkably rich language that could hold the complexity of two distinct worlds. The vocabulary of the home, the field, and the hearth remained stubbornly English, while the language of the state, the military, and the law became saturated with French influence. This was not a choice. It was a cultural compromise forced by the necessity of living together. The same fusion happened in the law. The old Anglo-Saxon customs, rooted in local assemblies and traditional rites, began to interweave with the more rigid, centralized judicial structures of the Normans. The resulting legal system, while still heavily skewed toward the interests of the elite, began to incorporate concepts of equity and administrative precedent that would define English law for centuries to come. Even the architecture, initially designed to dominate, began to lose its purely Norman starkness as it adopted local aesthetics and functions to better serve the land it occupied. This was not a harmonious blending. It was a slow, agonizing process where one identity was not so much erased as it was permanently altered. To be English after the conquest meant to carry the history of both the victim and the victor in one's veins. It meant to inhabit a landscape of foreign castles and indigenous fields, to pray in stone cathedrals that were built with the sweat of one's own ancestors, and to speak a language that was forever scarred by the trauma of invasion. But this hybridity became the new reality. It was a fusion that eventually created a nation with a depth of cultural memory that was unique in Europe. The English people of the 12th century were neither the people who had fought at Hastings, nor were they the Normans who had landed on the shore. They were something else entirely, a resilient composite society that had been forced to reinvent itself in the shadow of a catastrophe. They had learned to survive, and in doing so, they had unwittingly begun the long, slow work of building a New England from the debris of the old. The conquest had not destroyed the people. It had forged them in the furnace of an occupation that would never fully end, but would eventually, quietly, transform into something that belonged to everyone. Under William, England was not yet English in the way we understand it today. It was something older, stranger, and profoundly fractured, a land held together by the raw friction of force, fear, and the stubborn, unremarkable persistence of people who had no choice but to keep living. The castles still stand on their mounds, the cathedrals still loom over the town squares, and the language we speak today still carries the invisible, jagged wound of that collision. But the people who bore the weight of all of it, the farmers, the weavers, the shepherds, the mothers and the children, their names were never meant to be remembered by the chronicler. They were counted in the Domesday book, catalogued as lines in a ledger, assigned a value in silver and grain, and then left to the silence of history. But their impact was not in the records, it was in the soil. They were the ones who kept the hearth fires burning when the world felt as though it were ending. They were the ones who ensured that the cycle of the seasons remained unbroken, and they were the ones who preserved the identity of a nation long after the men who had conquered them were buried in their own stone tombs. To look at the map of England today is to see the ghost of 1066. The names of the villages, the boundaries of the shires, and the very structure of the fields often date back to that era of trauma and transition. Every time a person walks through a woodland that was once a royal forest, or stands within the ancient walls of a parish church, they are walking through the layers of a story that was never meant to be lost. The conquest may have been permanent in the halls of power, but it was incomplete in the heart of the village. As we look back across the divide of nearly a millennium, we must ask, who was the true architect of England? Was it the Duke who crossed the sea with an army of knights, or was it the peasant who, despite the loss of his lord, his language and his land, continued to plough the furrow, sow the seed, and raise the next generation in a landscape that had become a stranger to him? The conquest was a fire that burned the old world to the ground, but in the ashes the seeds of something else began to germinate. It was a cold, bitter beginning, but it was a beginning nonetheless. And so the story of 1066 is not just a story of defeat. It is a story of how a people, faced with the total destruction of their way of life, found the strength to endure, to adapt, and to carry their identity forward into an uncertain future. They didn't know that their suffering would eventually pave the way for a new civilization. They only knew the task in front of them, the heavy responsibility of existing in a world that had been rewritten by the hands of others. But in that endurance, they left something behind, an echo in the soil, a pulse in the language, and a memory that refuses to fade even after all this time. The question remains, how much of that old resilient spirit still lingers in the landscape today? While the Norman scribes were busy recording their version of events in the Domesday book, creating a paper trail of property and taxation, there was another archive being built, one that the invaders could neither measure nor command. This was the archive of the commoner, written not in ink or parchment, but in the collective memory of a people who were being forced into the shadows. Every village had its own invisible history. The stories told around the central hearth at night, the lullabies sung to children, the specific way a village marked the changing of the seasons, the local names given to streams and hills, these were the records of an England that predated the Battle of Hastings. The Normans could occupy the land, but they could not occupy the mind of the English peasant. They could demand the labour, but they could not demand the internal narrative of a family that remembered a time when they were free, when their ancestors were not just entries in a ledger, but individuals with names, history, and a place in the community. This cultural preservation was a quiet, relentless act of defiance. It was a refusal to let the Norman language, the Norman law, and the Norman hierarchy become the totality of existence. In the way an English mother taught her daughter to weave, or the way a father showed his son the secret paths through the marshlands, there was a rejection of the idea that their world had been truly conquered. They lived a parallel life. On the surface, they obeyed the foreign lord, paid the tithes, and performed the labour expected of them. But beneath that surface, they remained the guardians of a tradition that was older, deeper, and far more resilient than anything the Normans could build in stone. It is in these unrecorded interactions, the quiet conversations, the shared work, the traditional seasonal celebrations that we find the true endurance of the English identity. The Normans were building a monument to their own authority, but they were also inadvertently creating a crucible. By compressing the English population, by stripping them of their official status and pushing them to the margins, they were not destroying the culture, they were in a sense forcing it to focus, to concentrate, and to survive in a more potent, essential form. The Englishness of the people began to sharpen against the whetstone of Norman oppression. We must wonder what happened to those who were pushed to the very limits of endurance. When a family lost their home, when their fields were seized, and they were forced into the life of a wanderer, what did they take with them? They carried no gold, no deeds, no status. They carried only their memories, their skills, and the stories of who they were before the world broke. These refugees, scattering into the Midlands and the South, became the carriers of a cultural spark that would eventually ignite the English resistance to total assimilation. They were the invisible archives walking through the landscape, proving that while a kingdom can be occupied, a culture, when it is rooted in the very bones of the people, is a much more difficult thing to extinguish. The story of the conquest, therefore, is not merely a tale of a foreign king claiming a throne. It is a testament to the fact that the most significant history is often that which is never written down, but instead lived, breathed, and passed from one generation to the next in the silence of an occupied land. When the cathedrals grew cold with the sterile precision of Norman Latin, the English spirit retreated into the forests and the fields, into the folklore that belonged to them alone. The Normans brought a theology of authority, of hierarchies that mirrored their own feudal pyramid, God at the top, the king below him, and the Norman baron below the king. But the English people still clung to a spirituality that was entangled with the earth, the water, and the ancient wisdom of the land. This was the realm of folklore, a hidden, vital layer of existence that the Domesday Book could never account for. It existed in the stories told by the hearth when the firelight dimmed, tales of spirits that guarded the woods, of heroes who had once walked the land before the invaders came, and of a time when the soil itself recognized the names of those who tilled it. To the peasant, the forest was not just a resource to be managed by royal decree, it was a living, breathing entity populated by the echoes of their ancestors. This folklore was a language of its own. It was a means of keeping the old world alive in code. When the commoners spoke of a legendary king hiding in the hills, or of the spirits of the land reclaiming the ruins of a burned village, they were not merely entertaining themselves. They were articulating a hope that the current order was not the final word. They were asserting that the land remembered them even if the new lords did not. There was a profound dissonance here. On Sundays the people would go to the church and perform the rituals imposed by their Norman masters, repeating the prayers that felt like pebbles in their mouths. But on the other days they practiced a different kind of faith, a faith in the continuity of their own lineage, in the healing properties of local herbs, in the protective power of ancient symbols carved into the beams of their homes. This dual life, the outward submission and the inward defiance, became the defining psychological landscape of the post-1066 Englishman. The Normans considered these beliefs superstitions, the remnants of a pagan or backward past that their enlightened religion would eventually scrub clean. But they underestimated the power of these stories to bind a community together. Folklore provided a sense of belonging in a world where the structures of authority had been stripped away. It gave the people a history that couldn't be seized, a status that couldn't be taxed, and a dignity that couldn't be confiscated by a decree. In the face of a cold, towering stone church that spoke a foreign tongue, the English people found sanctuary in the hearth stories that were in every sense their own. This was a form of cultural survival that ensured the memory of England wouldn't just vanish, it would hibernate, waiting for the centuries to turn and the identity of the people to eventually reshape the very culture that had tried to swallow them. The story of the conquest, then, is not just about the men who fought, it is about the stories that refused to die. We have spoken of the loss of land, the burden of taxation, and the fracture of language. But there is another layer to the conquest, a darker, more intimate toll that does not appear in the Domesday Book or the annals of the kings. This is the unseen cost of survival, the psychological weight of living a life that is fundamentally compromised. To be a survivor of 1066 was to live with a permanent, low-grade ache in the consciousness of a nation. After 20, 30, even 40 years of Norman rule, the memory of what England meant began to shift. A child born in 1070 would have grown up in a world where the tower on the hill was a natural part of the horizon, where the foreign speech of the sheriff was the only voice of authority they had ever known, and where their own parents' stories of the old times sounded like half-forgotten myths. The trauma of the conquest was not just an event, it was an environment. It shaped the way people interacted with power, with their neighbours, and with themselves. There was a profound sense of self-betrayal that must have haunted the English farmers. To survive, they had to negotiate with the occupier. They had to pay the rent to the man who had burned their village. They had to bow to the knight who spoke a language they despised. This constant necessity of performing compliance, of smiling through the teeth, of measuring words to avoid the wrath of a Norman warden, eroded something deep within the sense of personal honour. It fostered a survival instinct that was undeniably brilliant, yet undeniably corrosive to the soul. The structure of the family unit, too, felt the pressure. When the margin for survival was so thin, and the threat of the king's forest laws or the crushing demand for labour was always looming, every choice became a calculation of risk. Could they afford to share food with a neighbour who had been dispossessed? Could they dare to voice a complaint against the local steward? The constant state of vigilance required for mere existence surely transformed the way families raised their children, teaching them not to reach, not to dream, but to endure. This was the inheritance of the conquered. It was a generational resilience that was forged in silence. They learned to hide their pride, to keep their traditions out of sight, and to measure the worth of their day by what they had managed to retain rather than what they had gained. They became masters of the hidden life. But this also meant that the vibrant, open and confident identity of the pre-1066 English was replaced by a more guarded, cynical and inward-looking national character. The conquest had not just taken their land, it had taken their sense of security in the world. They were now a people who expected the worst, who trusted no authority, and who relied solely on their own stubborn persistence. This was the true, silent legacy of the 11th century, a nation that had learned that the only way to endure the world was to become as unyielding and as silent as the stones themselves. By the end of the 11th century, the landscape of England itself felt as if it had been broken into pieces and stitched back together in a pattern that no longer made sense to those who lived within it. For generations, the land had been defined by ancestral boundaries, by the flow of rivers that guided trade, and by the ancient Roman roads that had connected the kingdom like the veins of a body. But the Normans, with their castles, their hunting forests, and their sudden arbitrary reallocation of estates, treated the land as a blank map upon which they could impose their will. The horizon was no longer defined by the village church or the common grazing land, it was now defined by the jagged silhouette of the Motte and Bailey towers. For a traveller moving between villages, the psychological experience was one of constant disorientation. You were no longer navigating a communal landscape, you were navigating a patchwork of private domains. 1 mile you might be under the jurisdiction of a baron who allowed the fields to be tended, and the next you might step into the king's forest, where a single misstep meant the loss of your hand. The land, which had once been a familiar friend, had become a minefield of legal hazards. This fragmentation extended into the very perception of time. The people who remembered the era of King Edward the Confessor spoke of it as if it were a lost golden age, not necessarily because it was perfect, but because it had been whole. Under the Normans, time felt disconnected, stuttered by the irregular demands of the new masters, the sudden summons for forced labour, the unpredictable visits of tax collectors armed with the Domesday records, and the arbitrary shifts in local governance. There was no longer a rhythm that belonged to the people, there was only the erratic, jarring beat of the occupier. This fragmentation of space and time left a mark on the collective consciousness of the population. People stopped looking at the horizon with a sense of ownership or belonging, and began to look at it with a sense of wariness. They became surveyors of their own survival, constantly scanning for the next intrusion, the next demand, the next shift in the wind of power. They were living in a landscape that was physically present, but psychologically distant. They knew every tree, every stone, and every hidden path, yet they were not truly the masters of these things anymore. This is what it means to live in a fragmented horizon. It is the state of being grounded in a place you know intimately, while simultaneously knowing that you have no authority over how that place is shaped or used. The Normans had fractured the unity of the English world, and for the people who endured it, the world would never again feel quite as solid or as certain. They were drifting in a new imposed reality, trying to find their footing in a kingdom that had been disassembled and reconstructed by strangers. It was a tragedy of geography, a loss of the very concept of a homeland as a place of safety and continuity. The horizon had been cut, and the people were left to navigate the gap between the world they remembered and the cold, unyielding reality that had been built on top of it. In the coldest of winters, when the granaries were low and the shadow of the Norman castle loomed longest over the village, where did the people find the strength to wake up the next morning? It is a question that haunts the archives of the 11th century. How does a population, systematically stripped of their power and placed under the boot of a foreign elite, continue to foster the internal spark of hope? For the people of England, hope was not a grand revolutionary concept. It was not the dream of a great battle that would sweep the invaders back across the sea. By the late 1070s, the dream of liberation had largely faded into the realm of legend. Instead, hope was small, local, and profoundly stubborn. It was the hope that the coming harvest would be just enough to survive the winter. It was the hope that a child would grow up to see the spring. It was the hope that despite the new laws and the foreign tongue, the fundamental truth of their lives, their work, their connection to the land, their existence, had value that no king could erase. This hope was an act of quiet rebellion. Every time a father taught his son how to read the clouds to predict a storm, or a mother passed down the rhythm of a traditional song, they were asserting that their culture was not dead. They were operating on a long time scale that the Norman rulers could not grasp. The conquerors lived for the next tribute, the next fortification, the next increase in land value. The people lived for the continuity of the human story. They understood, perhaps intuitively, that power is brittle and that the cycle of life is infinite. There was also a hope found in the shared silence of the village. It was a solidarity built on the knowledge that they were all suffering under the same cold sky. When a family shared a portion of their meagre meal with a neighbour, or when they helped to repair a broken fence in the middle of the night, they were weaving a web of human connection that the Norman hierarchy couldn't penetrate. This was the true architecture of England, not the stone keeps that stood on the mounds, but the network of relationships that existed in the wooden huts below. This hope did not lead to an uprising, but it did lead to something perhaps more powerful, the preservation of the self. By holding on to their identity, by refusing to internalize the Norman judgment of them as backward or subjugated, they were keeping a dormant England alive. They were the soil, and they knew that while the invaders might occupy the surface, the life within the earth would eventually emerge again. They were waiting, not for a sword, but for time itself to erode the sharp edges of the occupation. It is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit that even in the most fractured of horizons people find the capacity to imagine a future. That imagination, that quiet refusal to surrender the soul, was the ultimate defence of the English people. They did not win the Battle of 1066, but in the long centuries-spanning war for the identity of their nation, they were far from defeated. They were the ones who carried the flame through the dark, waiting for the day when the two bloodlines, the conqueror and the conquered, would finally blur into one. To truly understand the atmosphere of England in the decades following the conquest, one must look at the horizon by the 1080s. If you were a peasant travelling from one village to another, you were never truly alone. You were always being watched. The Norman solution to occupying a hostile population was not found in diplomacy or integration. It was found in the motte and bailey castle. These were not the romanticised stone fortresses of later centuries. They were raw, imposing, and terrifyingly efficient. Massive earth mounds topped with wooden palisades, looking down upon the thatched roofs of the villages they were built to dominate. They were constructed with incredible speed, often by the forced labour of the very people who lived in their shadows. For an English villager, the sight of a new mound rising on the edge of their parish was a chilling reminder that their world had been fundamentally altered. It was a physical manifestation of a new vertical social order, the Lord above, the people below. The psychological impact of these castles cannot be overstated. They were designed to instill a constant ambient fear. Every time a villager looked up toward the mound, they were reminded of the armed garrison within men who spoke a foreign tongue, who served a foreign master, and who held the power of life and death over the fields and the hearths below. The castle was not merely a military outpost. It was a permanent intrusion into the domestic life of the community. It regulated their movement, it enforced the new forest laws, and it served as the headquarters for the tax collectors who systematically stripped the villages of their surplus. This created a society defined by a profound stifling silence. Public conversation became guarded. The old village gatherings, where grievances might once have been aired, were now replaced by a wary stillness. The castle was the eye that never blinked. It turned the open, communal spirit of the Anglo-Saxon village into a claustrophobic, survival-oriented environment. People learned to walk with their eyes cast downward, to speak in lower tones, and to limit their activities to what was strictly necessary for survival. Yet beneath this enforced silence, a different kind of resistance was forming. It wasn't the resistance of open rebellion. The Normans had proven too brutal for that, but a resistance of internal consolidation, because the villagers were no longer permitted to shape the public life of their country. They retreated into the private, sacred space of the family and the local collective. They drew closer to one another, sharing burdens, hiding assets, and maintaining their own unrecorded history. The castle attempted to divide the people from their land and their autonomy, but in doing so it paradoxically forced the English to recognise their shared identity more sharply than ever before. The fear was real, the oppression was absolute, but the resilience of the people had begun to adapt to the shadows of the palisades. The question that loomed over every village was, how long could a society sustain itself when it was built entirely on the fear of the mound, and what would happen when that fear finally curdled into a cold, unbreakable resolve? While the Norman administrative machinery was obsessed with cataloguing the kingdom's wealth into the Domesday book, a parallel hidden economy was flourishing in the margins. The Normans, in their cold, analytical approach to power, believed that if they could control the markets, the mills, and the main trade routes, they could effectively siphon off the surplus of the English peasantry. But they underestimated the sheer inventiveness of a population that had been forced to learn the art of survival in the shadows of the motte and bailey castles. In the villages, the official market was a place of anxiety. Every transaction was watched by the Lord Steward, and every sack of grain or head of livestock was weighed against the potential for tax. It was a place where a farmer's profit was often snatched away before he could even reach his home, and so the English people developed the silent trade. It was not a formal market, nor was it ever recorded in the official ledgers of the realm. It was an intricate, informal network of trust that operated in the twilight hours or in the deep cover of the woodlands. If a weaver needed salt that he could not afford at the Lord's market, he would find a way to trade a bundle of wool with a shepherd who operated 3 villages away, completely bypassing the official channels. A potter might exchange his wares for a portion of the harvest from a farm that was technically underproductive in the eyes of the Norman commissioners. These exchanges were conducted with a level of discretion that was nearly invisible. A wink, a nod, or a pre-arranged drop-off in a clearing. These were the mechanisms of an underground economy that kept the English people fed and clothed without enriching their masters. This was a profoundly political act. By refusing to engage exclusively with the Norman regulated trade, the people were denying the conquerors the full harvest of their labour. They were carving out a small, protected space for themselves where their work had meaning and value that wasn't dictated by an occupier. It created a sense of solidarity that transcended village boundaries. You had to know who you could trust, and that network of trust became the backbone of a secret society of survivors. This silent trade was the true heartbeat of the English economy during the occupation. It was messy. It was decentralised, and it was entirely unmanageable by the Norman bureaucracy. The lords could build their stone cathedrals and their wooden forts, but they couldn't stop the hidden flow of goods that kept the village pulses beating. It was an act of constant, everyday defiance, a way of proving that even if they had lost the right to govern themselves, they had not lost the ability to sustain themselves. The Normans saw a broken kingdom to be exploited. The English saw a community to be preserved. As the years turned into decades, this hidden resilience didn't just keep them alive, it built the foundations of a national character that valued ingenuity and pragmatism above all else. The trade was silent, but its impact was loud. It was the quiet refusal to be impoverished by an empire that viewed them as nothing more than numbers in a ledger. If you stood inside the grand hall of a Norman castle, the air would be thick with the refined, sharp sounds of Old French, the language of law, chivalry, and the administrative decree. It was a language of distance and dominance. But if you were to walk down the hill, Past the bailey walls and into the dark, smoke-filled interior of a peasant's hut, you would find an entirely different linguistic world. You would hear the coarse, rhythmic and deeply rooted sounds of English. The hearth became the ultimate sanctuary of the English tongue. While the Norman lords commanded the world in their own language, the English people refused to relinquish the names of the things they loved most: mother, father, bread, water, earth, sun. These were not the words of a conquered people, they were the words of the land itself. In the shadow of the Normans, English underwent a transformation. It became the language of the private self, the language in which you expressed fear, love, grief, and the quiet jokes shared between neighbours. It is fascinating to observe how the language survived through the simple necessity of domestic life. A Norman master might issue commands in his dialect, but the English nurse who cared for his children whispered folk tales in the language of the hearth. A Norman tax collector might list assets in Latin, but the English farmer who hid his grain spoke of harvest and home in the tongue that had been passed down through generations. By relegating English to the private sphere, the Normans unknowingly allowed it to become something more resilient than it had ever been. It was no longer weighed down by the requirements of formal government. It was now free to become the language of feeling and belonging. This linguistic divide fostered a unique national psyche. It created a world where a person could possess two identities, one that they presented to the authorities guarded, silent and compliant, and one that they lived in the safety of their own home, where they were still the masters of their own story. The language of the hearth became the glue that held the fractured community together. When a traveller from a distant shire arrived at a village, they didn't need to understand the French of the court. They only needed to speak the language of the hearth to be welcomed, to be understood, and to be recognized as one of their own. This was the quiet triumph of the English tongue. It didn't fight the Norman invasion with swords or proclamations. It simply endured, waiting for the time when it would eventually re-emerge to reclaim the halls of power, transformed and enriched by the very collision that had once threatened to extinguish it. Every word spoken around those hearths was a link in a chain that stretched back to the foundations of the country, a defiant assertion that despite the occupation they were still themselves. As we look at the evolution of England, we see that the most enduring borders are not those marked by castle walls, but those drawn by the words we choose to use in the sanctity of our own homes. The fire in the hearth burned low, but the language around it burned with a clarity that the Norman scribes would never know. As the 11th century drew toward its close, a profound shift occurred in the collective consciousness of England. The living memory of the Battle of Hastings began to fade, but in its place a far more powerful force emerged, the weight of memory itself. For those who had stood on the battlefield or seen their homes burned in the immediate aftermath, the conquest was a personal tragedy. But for their grandchildren, those born into a landscape already dominated by stone keeps and foreign sheriffs, the conquest was something else entirely. It was a condition of existence. Memory is a living thing, and under the pressure of occupation, it transformed. The story of what was lost became the anchor of identity for the English people. They began to tell stories not just of the war, but of the world before the war. A world that in the retelling grew more idealized, more unified, and more vibrant with every passing year. This was not merely nostalgia, it was a psychological mechanism of preservation. By keeping the memory of a free England alive, they were refusing to accept that the Norman occupation was the final inevitable state of their nation. This weight of memory created a subtle, pervasive tension in every village. When a grandfather recounted the tales of the old things or the traditions of a forgotten local law, he was doing more than telling a story. He was transmitting a heritage that the Norman legal system could not reach. He was passing on a set of values, justice, community, and local autonomy that were fundamentally at odds with the feudal pyramid being imposed upon them. The Normans might have controlled the land and the taxes, but they were effectively excluded from this invisible archive of the people. This created a society that carried two histories simultaneously. There was the official written history, the one found in the Domesday book and the records of the bishoprics, documenting the land as a property to be managed. And then there was the history of the hearth, the oral tradition that documented the land as a home to be reclaimed. The weight of this second history was heavy. It instilled in the English people a sense of being other, a persistent feeling that they were living in an occupied space. This duality, this constant comparison between what was and what had been imposed, became a defining characteristic of the English national identity. We must consider the burden placed upon these younger generations. They were born into a world where their own history was a whispered secret, and their own language was treated as a rustic dialect. To survive, they had to navigate two cultures, knowing that their loyalty lay with the silent one. This constant navigation demanded a high level of social intelligence and a resilient sense of self. They were the bridge between the old England and the new, the ones who kept the flame of their identity burning through the long, dark years of adjustment. They proved that while an army can occupy a country, it cannot occupy the story that the people tell about themselves. And as long as that story remained intact, the occupation was always, in its essence, incomplete. The conquest had not conquered the people. It had only forced them to become the keepers of a memory that would eventually outlast the very walls that were built to contain them. By the late 11th century, the era of grand, open rebellion had largely vanished, quenched by the brutal efficiency of the Norman punitive expeditions. Yet the occupation was far from peaceful. It was characterized by a different, quieter phenomenon, a pervasive, unspoken rebellion that moved through the villages like a slow-burning fire. This was not a war of swords, it was a war of temperament. The Normans, with their penchant for bureaucracy, record-keeping and rigid hierarchy, expected a world that functioned like a clock. They wanted their taxes on time, their labour services performed with precision, and their new laws followed to the letter. But they were met with the impenetrable wall of the English passive resistance. This was the art of the intentional delay, the feigned ignorance, and the subtle subversion of orders. If a Norman steward demanded a field be cleared for a new fortification, the villagers would comply, but the work would be agonizingly slow, marred by accidental breakages of tools and sudden inexplicable illnesses among the labourers. If a new tax regulation was posted, the village headman would listen, nod in understanding, and then, with frustrating consistency, fail to implement it correctly, citing the confusion of the language barrier or the complexity of local custom. These were not acts of open defiance that could be punished with execution. They were small, exasperating frictions that slowed the Norman machine to a crawl. This unspoken rebellion was in many ways more damaging to the Norman project than a brief failed uprising. It kept the occupiers in a constant state of uncertainty. They owned the land, they commanded the law, but they could not command the cooperation of the people. They were forced to exist in a state of perpetual frustration, never fully confident that their decrees would actually take root. The English people had realized that their greatest weapon was their indispensability. The Normans needed them to farm the fields, to shear the sheep, and to sustain the very lifestyle the conquerors had come to enjoy. By withholding their full effort, the English were making a profound political statement. We are the masters of this land's productivity, and you are merely its guests. This was a dangerous game, one that required immense courage and a deep collective understanding. It meant risking punishment for the sake of asserting one's own agency, but it also provided a psychological victory. Every time a villager successfully navigated a bureaucratic hurdle, or every time a collective decision was made to ignore a burdensome decree, they were reaffirming their own worth. They were showing that while their country had been conquered, their spirit and their mastery over the daily life of the kingdom remained intact. This was the silent, gritty reality of the 1080s and 1090s, an occupied nation that refused to let its conquerors truly settle in, keeping the occupiers in a state of fragile control, always wondering why their New England felt so stubbornly and so quietly like the old one. In the grand scheme of the Norman project, the village church was not just a place of worship, it was an ideological outpost. The Normans, with their soaring stone arches and complex rigid hierarchies, sought to replace the humble timber-built churches of the Anglo-Saxons with structures that screamed of Romanesque authority. To walk into a new Norman-built parish church was to be reminded, with every look toward the altar, that the divine order was now filtered through the lens of the conqueror. But for the English villagers, the destruction of their old wooden churches was a traumatic tearing away of their roots. These small buildings were not merely places to hear the gospel, they were the repositories of local identity. They held the graves of ancestors whose names were now being erased by the cold stone slabs of the new regime. The loss of these churches meant the loss of a tangible connection to the past, a physical link to a history that stretched back before the first Norman sail had ever touched the English shore. Yet even in this, the people found a way to resist. If you look closely at the masonry of many early Norman churches in England, you will find strange anomalies. A carved animal figure here, an intricate knotwork pattern there, relics of a design language that was distinctly, stubbornly Anglo-Saxon. These were the secret messages, carved by local stonemasons who were forced to build the new structures but refused to strip them of their soul. They hid their heritage in the details, embedding the old symbols of protection, nature and ancestral belief into the very walls that were designed to symbolize their subjugation. This was an architecture of the soul. The people could not stop the construction, so they repurposed it. They continued to bring their old traditions to the new spaces, honouring their local saints, those figures of Anglo-Saxon history whom the Norman bishops tried to marginalise in the quiet corners of the churchyards. They maintained their own calendar of observance, their own local pilgrimages, and their own prayers, effectively creating a church within the church. It was a profound form of cognitive dissonance. On the surface they were participating in the liturgical life of the Norman Church, but in their hearts they were honouring a lineage that the new authorities could neither see nor grasp. The stone might have been Norman, but the space was filled with an English presence that refused to be evicted. This persistence turned the church into a site of tension rather than submission. It reminded every villager, every time they walked through those doors, that their history was still alive, layered just beneath the surface of the new order. They were the silent custodians of a faith that was older than the conquest, a faith that was bound not to a decree from Rome or a command from the king, but to the very soil where their ancestors lay. This was the final, most intimate stage of their endurance, the ability to find sanctuary within the very monuments of their own defeat. As the decades drifted by, a slow, irreversible alchemy began to take hold. The sharp, cold steel of the conquest, which had once divided the nation into two distinct camps, the victor and the vanquished, began to dull. The reality was that neither side could function without the other. The Norman baron needed the English farmer to make the land profitable, and the English farmer, though he loathed his master, needed the relative stability that the new, albeit brutal order provided. This mutual necessity became the bridge across which the two cultures began to crawl, however slowly and reluctantly. This was not a process of reconciliation, but one of assimilation. The Normans, who had arrived as warriors seeking plunder, were slowly being transformed by the very land they occupied. They began to adopt local customs, not out of respect, but out of practicality. They needed to understand the local weather, the local soil, and the local temperament if they were to thrive. Conversely, the English people began to incorporate the administrative logic of the Normans into their own lives. They learned to navigate the feudal courts, to use the new legal language, and to leverage the Norman bureaucracy to protect their own interests. The melting of the sword was painful and slow. It was the sound of a language beginning to blend, the sight of Norman architecture softening with English motifs, and the emergence of a social fabric that was neither entirely foreign nor entirely native. The deep-seated resentment remained, buried like roots beneath a forest floor, but it began to yield to the reality of a shared future. The English identity, once thought to be shattered by the invasion, was not destroyed. It was evolving, absorbing the shock of the conquest and using it to broaden its own capacity. This hybridity was the true unintended consequence of William's ambition. He had sought to create a Norman colony, but he had instead forged the crucible for a new, tougher and more complex nation. The men who had fought at Hastings would not have recognized the England of the late 11th century. It was a country that had become an entity unto itself, a synthesis born of violence, matured in silence and sustained by the sheer persistence of those who lived within it. The sword had not broken the people had, through the long, agonizing patience of survival, finally begun to absorb the sword into their own story. As the turn of the century approached, a quiet but monumental shift occurred within the scriptoriums of the cathedrals and the small private libraries of the newly emerging middle class. The monopoly on history, the privilege of deciding what was remembered and what was forgotten, began to slip from the hands of the Norman conquerors. For 30 years the story of 1066 had been told only by the victors, recorded in Latin as a triumph of providence and military genius. But now a new generation was picking up the quill. These were the children of the hybrid age, men who were educated in the sophisticated bureaucratic traditions of the Norman Church, but whose bloodlines, whose hearth tales, and whose fundamental view of the world were deeply, irrevocably English. They looked at the official chronicles of their fathers and uncles with a critical eye. They began to see the gaps, the silences, and the blatant erasures of the common people. This was the reclaiming of the narrative. They didn't write as rebels, that would have been dangerous and short-lived, but as observers, chroniclers and record-keepers, by documenting the history of the villages, the customs of the parishes, and the grievances of the local inhabitants alongside the deeds of the kings. They were creating a multi-layered history. They were weaving the experience of the conquered into the fabric of the conqueror's record. It was a subtle scholarly subversion. Through their works, the stories of the commoner, the resistance, the quiet suffering, the endurance, were slowly legitimized. They were no longer just oral traditions whispered in the dark. They were becoming part of the written heritage of the land. This was an act of profound courage. It meant acknowledging the trauma of the conquest without inciting violence, and it meant preserving the identity of the English people within the very documents that were meant to prove their subjugation. This shift in authorship changed everything. It meant that the New England was not just a Norman creation, it was being co-authored by the very people it had sought to replace. By taking control of the narrative, the English people were ensuring that their history would not end in the ash heaps of Hastings. They were planting their flag in the landscape of ideas, asserting that a nation's history is not defined by who sits on the throne, but by the memory of the people who cultivate the land. The quill, it seemed, was becoming a far more powerful weapon than the sword had ever been. As they sat in the quiet of their scriptoriums, scratching their pens across the parchment, they were doing more than writing history. They were finalizing the process of survival, ensuring that the soul of their people would remain an indelible, permanent feature of the land they refused to leave. By the dawn of the 12th century, the acute agony of the conquest had begun to settle into a dull, familiar ache, a permanent feature of the English landscape. For the people who lived through these decades, there was a profound sense of normalization. The world they had known in 1066 was so distant that it had become a dream, and the world of the Norman stone castle, the rigid tax ledger, and the foreign lord was simply reality. This was not a happy peace, nor was it a reconciliation. It was a survival-hardened adaptation. The trauma of the invasion had been metabolized. It had been baked into the customs, the songs, and the very structure of village life. People no longer spent their days waiting for the return of an Anglo-Saxon king. They spent their days working the land, raising their children, and negotiating the realities of a feudal system that had become inescapable. The brilliance of this endurance lay in its invisibility. The English people had adopted the tools of their oppressors to protect their own essence. They used the Norman courts to settle their internal disputes. They used the new trade networks to sustain their local economies. In doing so, they subtly turned the Norman administrative machinery against its own rigidity. They had learned that the most effective way to exist under an occupier was not to stand in their way, but to outlast them by becoming an essential, immutable part of their infrastructure. Yet this normalization came at a cost, a deep generational scar. The memory of what was lost, the freedom, the pride, the unity of the old world was still carried in the blood, transmitted through the language of the hearth. Even as they walked the paths of a landscape now dotted with Norman keeps, they did so with an awareness that they were the survivors of a broken world. They were the bridge between two eras, carrying the weight of an identity that had been tested to its absolute limit and had refused to snap. We see this in the emerging language of the time, a creolization, a messy, beautiful mix of the Germanic roots of the English people and the Romance influences of the conquerors. It was not a language of choice, but a language of survival. It was a reflection of the reality they lived, a synthesis of two worlds that could no longer be separated. This was the true final victory of the English people. They didn't reclaim their past by erasing the Norman present. They reclaimed their future by absorbing the conquest into themselves. They had become a new kind of nation, forged by fire and tempered by time, possessing a character that was now far too complex, far too layered, and far too resilient to ever be fully conquered again. The normalization of their trauma was not the end of their story, it was the foundation upon which everything else would eventually be built. As the shadow of the conquerors lengthened across the 12th century, a strange irony began to manifest in the halls of power. The men who had arrived in 1066 as a lean, hungry military elite were beginning to lose their edge. Through the wealth they had extracted and the land they had secured, they had become static, bureaucratic, and crucially dependent on the land they had seized. The Norman identity, once a symbol of sharp imported dominance, was becoming diluted by the very environment it had sought to command. The castles, once symbols of raw terror, were beginning to feel less like fortresses and more like homes. The barons, once nomads of the battlefield, were becoming landlords and regional administrators. They were no longer just military occupiers, they were becoming part of the landscape. And as they put down roots, they began to inherit the very problems and priorities of the people they ruled. They had to deal with the same unpredictable harvests, the same local disputes, and the same harsh winters. Slowly, the distance between the lord on the mound and the villager in the hut began to shrink, not through love, but through the shared grinding reality of life in England. This was the slow Englishing of the Norman elite. They still spoke their French, they still held their titles, but they were no longer purely Norman. They were the masters of an English realm. The shadow they cast was still long, but it was no longer a shadow that aimed to swallow the people whole. Instead, it was becoming the framework for a new kind of society, one that was still unequal, still harsh, but one that was starting to move in a single unified rhythm. For the common people, this was a realization of quiet power. They had watched the conquerors rise, dominate, and eventually become absorbed by the gravity of the land. The invaders had tried to change England, but in the end it was England that had changed them. The foreignness of the rulers was fading, replaced by a complex layered reality where the blood of the Viking-descended Normans and the Anglo-Saxon inhabitants began to drift toward a common horizon. This was not the end of the conflict, but it was the end of the conquest. The stage was now set for the next chapter, one where the identity of the people was no longer a matter of us against them, but a matter of how the new, blended England would navigate its own future. The shadow of the conquerors had not vanished, but it had ceased to be an occupying force. It had become the past, a legacy woven into the very structure of the nation. As we look at the late 11th and early 12th centuries, we realize that the most successful resistance wasn't the one that forced the invaders out, it was the one that forced the invaders to become part of the nation they had tried to subjugate. The conquest was complete, but it was a victory that belonged to no one, and a defeat that had been transformed into the foundation of a new, enduring identity. If you were to walk into a local manor court in the early 12th century, you would witness a fascinating struggle between two worlds: the written, rigid law of the Norman conquerors and the fluid, resilient, customary law of the English. The Normans brought with them a system of charters, deeds, and precise written records, a world where truth was defined by what was etched into parchment. But the English people operated on a different frequency. They relied on the living memory of the community. When a dispute arose, perhaps over the boundaries of a grazing field or the rights to cut timber, the Norman steward would consult his rolls, but the village elders would rely on something far older and, in their eyes, far more sacred: the memory of what had always been. They would recount stories of how their fathers and grandfathers had used the land, invoking the names of predecessors who had walked those paths long before the invaders arrived. This was not just a stubborn refusal to accept the new records, it was an assertion that the land itself had a history that no decree could overwrite. This reliance on custom was a sophisticated form of civil disobedience. By prioritizing the oral tradition of the village over the written document of the castle, the people were effectively reclaiming their right to define their own reality. They turned every legal dispute into an act of cultural preservation. The Norman stewards, often frustrated by the villagers' insistence on how it has always been, found themselves constantly forced to negotiate. To keep the peace and ensure the land remained productive, they often had to defer to these local customs. This created a unique hybrid legal system. The Normans kept their charters, but they increasingly had to incorporate the local customs into their rulings to make them enforceable. The English people had successfully colonized the conqueror's legal system from within. They didn't need to burn the law books, they simply made the laws bend to fit the landscape they knew so intimately. It was a quiet, relentless victory. It meant that even under Norman rule, the fundamental rules of life, the shared responsibility of the village, the protective boundaries of the common land remained anchored in the English experience. It taught the population that they held the keys to the land's actual administration, regardless of who held the title to the manor. This was the true engine of English survival, the realization that laws are only as strong as the community that upholds them. As the legal systems began to blur, the Norman authority was slowly being woven into the very structure of English local governance, and in the process it lost its foreign edge. The law was no longer a weapon wielded from the castle. It was becoming a conversation between the occupier and the occupied, a conversation where, over time, the voice of the people was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. In the quiet of the 12th century English countryside, a remarkable phenomenon was unfolding. The values that had defined the Anglo-Saxon world, values of mutual aid, local governance, and a profound rhythmic connection to the seasonal calendar, were not being erased by the Norman imposition. Instead, they were undergoing a silent, tectonic migration. They moved from the sphere of public power, which had been seized by the conquerors, into the sphere of daily existence, where they became the bedrock of survival. For the villagers, the gemot, the old communal assembly, had lost its formal status, but the spirit of the gemot lived on in the way decisions were made in the fields and at the church gates. The English people had an innate, deeply ingrained understanding of how to manage a community without needing a central authority to dictate every move. They practiced a form of collective agency that the Norman barons, with their rigid, top-down commands, initially struggled to comprehend. As the years passed, the Norman lords began to realize that their estates functioned most efficiently when they left the local English practices largely untouched. A harvest was gathered more quickly, a conflict resolved more cleanly, and a tax payment handled more reliably when the villagers were allowed to operate according to their own long-established social rhythms. This was a subtle, unacknowledged capitulation. The conquerors were learning that to command the land, they had to respect the people who knew the land. This resurgence of native values was the most powerful form of endurance. It was the refusal of the English character to be reshaped into a Norman mould. Instead, they forced the mould to expand to accommodate them. They maintained their traditional ways of sharing labour, of supporting the elderly, and of honouring the cycles of the seasons. These were not just customs, they were an assertion of humanity in a system that viewed them primarily as units of economic output. As we look at the late 11th and early 12th centuries, we see a nation that was slowly reclaiming itself, not by force of arms, but by the sheer unyielding gravity of its own culture. The values of the ancestors, once thought to be shattered by the catastrophe of 1066, were rising to the surface, tempering the sharp edges of the Norman occupation. They created a new kind of social stability, a stability built on the collective wisdom of the village rather than the iron grip of the castle. This was the moment when the English people began to move from the position of the conquered to the position of the custodians. They were the ones who held the keys to the kingdom's longevity. And as the Normans gradually aligned themselves with these native rhythms, the country began to breathe with a new unified pulse. The values had not just survived, they had won. As the 12th century matured, a subtle but vital shift occurred in the relationship between the lord and the land. For the first generation of Norman conquerors, the English peasantry was simply a resource to be squeezed, but for their sons and grandsons the perspective changed. They were no longer adventurers in a foreign land, they were landowners whose stability, wealth and local authority depended entirely on the cooperation of the people beneath them. This created an unprecedented opening for the English populace. When a Norman baron found himself entangled in the complex power struggles of the wider Angevin Empire, or when he needed to consolidate his hold against a rival, he suddenly required more than just the labour of his tenants. He required their loyalty, their local intelligence, and their stability. He needed to ensure that his estates wouldn't erupt into unrest while he was away. For the English, this was a moment of profound realization. They had spent decades honing their silent rebellion, but now the dynamic began to tilt. They learned to leverage their necessity. If a lord wanted a productive harvest during a time of political instability, he had to offer concessions, perhaps a lighter hand in taxation, or the formal recognition of long-standing village rights that had been ignored during the initial years of the occupation. It was a cautious, unspoken negotiation. This shift in allegiance was not a grand public treaty, it was a granular village-level adjustment. It happened in the quiet conversations between the manor steward and the village headmen. It happened when the lord realized that a contented village was his strongest defensive wall against internal rivals. The English people had effectively transformed themselves from victims into stakeholders. They were not yet free, nor were they equal to their masters, but they had moved from the status of a conquered population to the status of a foundational class that the elite could not afford to alienate. They held the keys to the kingdom's heartbeat, the food, the labour and the local order. By understanding this, they regained a measure of control over their own lives. The allegiance that had once been purely forced was slowly becoming something else, a complex, pragmatic partnership of convenience. This evolution in the power dynamic meant that the England of the mid-12th century was no longer a country of two warring camps. It was becoming a fragile yet cohesive society where the conquerors were increasingly bound by the consent of the people they ruled. The shadow of the occupation was lifting, replaced by the early tentative light of a nation learning to live with itself. In the absence of their own written chronicles, the English people turned to an older, more resilient medium, the oral tradition. Folklore became the secret archive of the nation. While the Norman scribes were busy recording land titles in their crisp, Latin-filled manuscripts, the village storytellers were weaving a different kind of history, a history of spirit, of defiance, and of the land itself. These stories were not merely entertainment. They were acts of resistance. By transforming historical figures, the last Thegans, the fallen warriors of Hastings, or the leaders of local uprisings into legendary figures, the people were ensuring they would never be forgotten. They turned the trauma of the conquest into the mythos of survival. A local stream or an ancient oak tree became a site of memory, a place where, according to the elders, the old England still lingered. The Norman masters often dismissed these stories as the superstitious ramblings of an uneducated peasantry. This was their greatest miscalculation. By treating these stories as trivial, they allowed them to spread unchecked. Every time a mother sang a lullaby about the glory of a lost kingdom, or a grandfather recounted a tale of a hero who stood against the invaders, they were reinforcing the identity of their children. They were creating a mental map of England that was distinctly different from the one drawn by the Norman surveyors. This oral history did more than preserve the past. It shaped the future. It instilled in the younger generation a sense of continuity. They didn't feel like they were living at the beginning of history, under the shadow of the Norman throne. They felt like they were living in the middle of a much longer, grander story that would eventually see the conquerors fade away. This perspective provided them with an immense psychological fortitude. They could endure the hardships of the present because they believed in the permanence of their own story. In this way, folklore became the ultimate defense. It was a history that could not be burned, confiscated, or taxed. It existed only in the minds and hearts of the people, an invisible landscape that the Normans couldn't occupy. As the 12th century continued to unfold, this hidden oral history began to inform the way people saw their place in the world. It turned the village into a bastion of identity, and it ensured that even in the darkest years of subjugation, the English people never truly lost sight of who they were. The stories were the seeds that would eventually sprout into a new, revitalized English identity, proving that the most powerful weapon a conquered people can possess is the ability to remember. By the middle of the 12th century, the landscape of England had been permanently altered by the hundreds of motte and bailey structures that had sprouted like scars across the countryside. Yet something unexpected happened to these symbols of Norman dominion. They began to lose their initial terrifying purpose. As the threat of large-scale English rebellion subsided and the power of the central monarchy became more entrenched, the castle stopped being merely a military outpost and began to evolve into something else entirely, a seat of local governance. Around the base of these stone keeps, a new kind of settlement began to stir: the castle town. Originally, the land around the fortress had been a zone of exclusion, a place where the local populace was expected to keep their distance, but necessity eventually broke down those barriers. The garrison inside needed goods, the lords needed merchants to handle the trade of their surplus crops, and the local blacksmiths and weavers found that the security, however stifling, provided by the castle walls offered a degree of stability for their businesses. These towns were the physical manifestation of the forced coexistence between Norman and English. A marketplace would form in the bailey, where the language of commerce was a pragmatic mix of French and English, a market tongue that facilitated the exchange of goods despite the cultural divide. The castle, once a point of absolute separation, was becoming a point of unavoidable contact. This evolution was a quiet victory for the English people. By integrating themselves into the economic life of the castle, they were effectively humanizing the structure that had been built to subdue them. They were no longer just the people who lived in the shadow of the fortress. They were now the people who fueled the economy that the fortress served. The lord might still hold the keys to the gate, but the villagers held the keys to the town's prosperity. This shift in function changed the psychological weight of the castle. It was no longer just an eye that stared down in judgment. It was becoming a hub, a centre of interaction, and a fixture in the daily life of the community. The fear that had once paralysed the population was slowly being replaced by a mundane, workaday reality. The castle remained, but it was being absorbed into the life of the nation. It was a perfect metaphor for the era. The Norman apparatus was being swallowed by the sheer, persistent daily reality of the English people. They had not torn down the walls, but they had moved in, set up shop, and started to live their lives within the structures of their own defeat, eventually making those structures serve their own needs. The conquerors had built their fortresses to last forever, but they hadn't counted on the people living long enough to turn them into the centres of their own communal life. As the 12th century progressed, the original Norman hierarchy, so sharp and clearly defined, began to show its cracks. The sheer administrative burden of managing a kingdom, collecting taxes, presiding over courts, and maintaining the king's peace proved far too immense for the dwindling number of Norman elites. They needed eyes and ears on the ground, and more importantly, they needed people who understood the complex, messy realities of English village life. This necessity birthed a new, influential class, the middle tier. These were the stewards, the bailiffs, and the clerks, men who were often of local English descent or who had married into the community. They were the bridge between the castle and the cottage. They spoke the language of the conqueror's law, but they understood the needs and grievances of the English peasantry. They were the ones who truly kept the gears of the kingdom turning, and in doing so, they found themselves in a position of unexpected power. For the English people, the rise of this middle tier was a subtle triumph. For the first time in generations, they were dealing with local administrators who were not entirely foreign to them. While these men still represented the interests of their Norman lords, they were also tethered to the communities they managed. They knew when to apply the letter of the law, and when to turn a blind eye to save a struggling family from ruin. They were the fixers of the 12th century, navigating the delicate path between satisfying their Norman superiors and preserving the well-being of their neighbours. This integration was a slow, quiet infiltration of the Norman structure. By filling these positions, the English people were ensuring that their interests were represented at the table where decisions were made. They weren't just obeying the laws anymore, they were interpreting them, enforcing them, and sometimes creatively adjusting them. They were becoming indispensable to the very regime that had once sought to marginalize them. This middle tier was the precursor to a more cohesive English society. These men were the first to demonstrate that power in England was not something that could be wielded purely through brute force or top-down decree. It had to be managed, negotiated, and negotiated with care. This was the moment the English people moved from being subjects to being participants. They had learned the rules of the Norman game so well that they were now setting the pace. As the middle tier grew in influence, the line between the conqueror and the conquered began to fade, replaced by a complex network of obligations and local allegiances that formed the true skeleton of the nation. The state was no longer a foreign entity imposed upon the land, it was becoming a local system, managed by the very people the invaders had once tried to render silent. By the mid-12th century, the silence that had once defined the linguistic divide was beginning to fill with a new, vibrant sound. The rigid separation between the French spoken in the halls of the lords and the English spoken in the fields of the peasants had started to dissolve. It was not a sudden change, but a slow, rhythmic fusion, a linguistic alchemy that occurred wherever the two peoples met, in the marketplaces, in the parish churches, and in the courts of the manor. The language of the Normans, with its vocabulary of governance, law, and high culture, began to seep into the bedrock of the English tongue. Terms for justice, court, tax, and government began to merge with the deeply rooted earthy words for home, bread, heart, and kin. This was not the extinction of English, it was its massive structural enrichment. The conqueror's language was being absorbed, stripped of its arrogance, and repurposed to serve the needs of a nation that was finally learning to speak for itself. For the English people, this was the ultimate reclamation. By adopting the words of their rulers, they were not submitting, they were taking ownership of the administrative tools that had been used to control them. They began to use French terminology to discuss their own rights, their own land, and their own communal disputes. It was a linguistic coup d'état, the moment the occupied began to use the language of the occupier to demand their own dignity. This common tongue became the defining feature of the new English identity. It was a language that carried the scars of the conquest, but also the resilience of those who had endured it. It was a language capable of describing both the brutal reality of the castle and the quiet sanctity of the hearth. As a young child growing up in this hybrid world, the experience was profound. They were heirs to two legacies, inheriting both the sharpness of the Norman mind and the endurance of the English spirit. The emergence of this unified language was the final irreversible sign that the occupation was coming to an end. A nation that shares a common vocabulary is a nation that shares a common future. The barrier that had once held the people apart was now the very thing that bound them together. As people spoke, they weren't just exchanging information, they were participating in the creation of a national consciousness that was far greater than the sum of its parts. The conquest had not succeeded in creating a Norman England. It had failed spectacularly in that regard. Instead, it had forced the creation of something far more enduring, a language, and by extension a nation, that was forged in the fire of collision and tempered by the patience of survival. The story of 1066 was no longer a story of defeat, it was the prologue to a much larger, more complex epic, the epic of a people who had taken the pieces of their broken world and used them to build something entirely and uniquely their own. By the twilight of the 12th century, the long transformative shadow of the Norman Conquest had finally begun to lift, leaving behind a nation that was entirely, irrevocably changed. The people of England, whether their ancestry traced back to the mist-shrouded halls of the Anglo-Saxon kings or the sun-drenched vineyards of Normandy, found themselves sharing something far more profound than just a border. They shared a history that was now exclusively their own. The consolidation of this new identity was not found in a royal proclamation or a treaty, but in the mundane, everyday life of the people. It was found in the way a farmer and his lord understood the boundaries of their common landscape. It was found in the way the new laws were adapted to suit the old customs, creating a legal fabric that was as unique as the soil itself. It was found in the way the language had bent, stretched, and folded to encompass both the grit of the earth and the complexity of governance. This was the ultimate answer to the catastrophe of 1066. The conquest had been intended to break the English spirit and replace it with a Norman template, yet the opposite had occurred. The English people had exerted a gravitational pull so immense that it had absorbed the very identity of their conquerors. The Normans, in their attempt to build a lasting legacy, had inadvertently built the framework for the very nation they had sought to overwrite. We look back at these years, not as a tragedy of subjugation, but as a crucible of character. Every act of quiet resistance, every story whispered by the hearth, and every negotiation over the rights of the manor had been a brick in the wall of a new national identity. The English were no longer defined by their defeat, they were defined by their endurance. They had proven that a nation is not a fragile thing to be crushed by an army or decreed into existence by a king. A nation is a living, breathing connection, a collective memory passed down through the blood and the soil. As the 12th century gave way to the next, England stood as a testament to the idea that identity is not something we are given, but something we create through the sheer refusal to disappear. The sword of Hastings had cut deep, but the people had healed around the wound, turning the scar into a seam that held their world together. They had emerged as a people who knew exactly who they were, a synthesis of all that they had lost and everything they had managed to hold on to. The story of the conquest was finished, but the story of the English people, complex, scarred, defiant and whole, was only just beginning. As we stand at the close of this era, the grand narrative of 1066 and its long, turbulent aftermath reveals a fundamental truth about human history. It is not the victors who ultimately define the destiny of a land, but the people who remain. The legacy of the conquest is not found in the crumbling stone of the early Norman keeps, nor in the dry Latin rolls of the Domesday book. It is found in the DNA of a culture that refused to be eclipsed. The persistence of the English people during these 100 years was not a passive endurance, it was a radical assertion of existence. By clinging to their language, their customs and their collective memory, they turned every day of the occupation into a victory of continuity. They taught us that identity is not a static treasure to be guarded, but a living, changing fire that must be fed. Even when stripped of political agency, when taxed to the edge of ruin, and when faced with a regime that sought to erase their history, they found ways to persist. This legacy of persistence is the greatest gift of the 12th century. It serves as a reminder that the resilience of a people is the most potent force on earth. The conquerors came with swords and stone, expecting to reshape the world in their image, but they found themselves working with materials they could not control, the stubborn memory and the enduring will of the local population. They learned slowly and painfully that power is ephemeral, but the character of a nation is rooted in something much deeper, the daily quiet labour of living. For the descendants of those who lived through the long shadow of the conquest, this history is more than just a sequence of events. It is a roadmap of survival. It tells them that they come from a lineage of the resilient, people who survived the worst of times not by heroics alone, but by the steady, unrelenting refusal to surrender their humanity. Their story is a testament to the idea that no matter how drastically a society is altered from above, the foundation, the collective soul of the people, will always find a way to reassert itself. As we close this chapter, we realize that the England which emerged from this crucible was not a broken nation, but one that had been tempered and strengthened. It was a nation that knew the value of what it had kept and the necessity of what it had learned. The conquest had not succeeded in silencing the people. It had only forced them to find a louder, more resilient voice. The legacy they left behind is a quiet, enduring defiance that echoes across the centuries. The understanding that the most powerful act a people can commit is simply to endure, to adapt, and to carry their story into the future, no matter the weight of the shadow they are forced to walk under. When we reach the final vantage point of this century-long odyssey, we look back not at a landscape of ruins, but at the foundations of a modern world. The England that crystallized at the end of the 12th century was no longer a collection of tribes or a territory of foreign masters. It was a country that had found a new, complex rhythm of existence. The trauma of 1066, the slow friction of the occupation, and the long, agonizing process of assimilation had all converged to create something entirely new. The people who lived through these years were the architects of this transformation. They were the ones who sat in the village councils, who sang the old songs while working the new fields, and who blended their native tongue with the language of the court. They were the anonymous custodians of history, who ensured that the thread of their identity never snapped. In their persistence, they bequeathed to the future a nation defined not by who was in power, but by the resilient collective character of those who worked the soil. Today we look back at their lives as a reflection of our own. The struggles they faced, the negotiation of identity, the preservation of culture amidst rapid change, and the pursuit of agency are timeless challenges. We see in them the same human desire to define oneself against the weight of external forces. The English identity that emerged from this crucible was a masterpiece of compromise, a synthesis forged in the fires of conflict and tempered by the patience of generations. This history teaches us that no culture is ever truly static. It is a river, constantly shifting its course, absorbing tributaries, and navigating the obstacles placed in its path. The conquest was a violent damming of that river, but it could not stop the flow. Instead, it forced the water to deepen, to pool, and eventually to carve a new, more powerful channel. The legacy of those who lived between 1066 and the end of the 12th century is not just the memory of what they endured, it is the reality of who we are. As we close this chronicle, we honour the anonymous figures whose quiet labour made this synthesis possible. They were the ones who refused to be erased, the ones who kept the stories alive, and the ones who ensured that the foundation of their identity would endure long after the last Norman keep had turned to dust. Their journey reminds us that in the grand narrative of human experience, every day of survival is a victory, and every generation that carries the torch of its ancestors is an act of defiance against oblivion. They did not just survive history, they mastered it, weaving their experience into the very fabric of the future we now call our own. As the internal scars of the 11th and 12th centuries began to fade into the bedrock of national memory, a profound change occurred in the English psyche. For over 100 years, the nation had been turned inward, obsessed with the immediate, pressing realities of the conquest. Taxation, land rights, local governance, and the struggle for cultural survival, but with the consolidation of a hybrid identity, the horizon began to expand. The people who had emerged from the crucible were no longer defined by the trauma of Hastings. They were a more complex, adaptable, and hardened breed. They had inherited the administrative precision of the Normans and the gritty, land-bound resilience of the Anglo-Saxons. This synthesis had created a unique national energy that could no longer be contained within the borders of the island. The outward gaze began in the docks and marketplaces. Merchants who had once only dealt in local grain now looked to the trade routes of the continent. Scholars who had once been isolated within their cloisters began to look toward the broader intellectual movements of Europe. The very language they spoke, that new, rich, hybrid tongue, was becoming a tool that could articulate not just local grievances, but broader ambitions. This was the transition from a defensive survivalist culture to an emergent power. It was a subtle realization. They were no longer just the victims of historical forces, they were beginning to influence them. The barons, once purely occupied with holding their English manors, began to engage in the intricate, high-stakes diplomacy of the Angevin Empire. The common folk, though still anchored to the land, found themselves participating in a wider economic ecosystem that stretched far beyond the English Channel. This shift was not without risk. To look outward was to invite new conflicts, new alliances, and new complexities. But for a people who had survived the total collapse of their old world, the prospect of the unknown was no longer as terrifying as it once was. They had learned that the world was vast, unforgiving, and ever-changing, and they had gained the confidence to navigate it. The shadow of the conquerors had been replaced by the light of a maturing nation. They were no longer merely waiting for history to happen to them. They were starting to step out, cautiously but decisively, to meet it halfway. This was the birth of a new global consciousness, a testament to the fact that those who have been tempered in the fire of extreme change are the best equipped to face the challenges of the wider world. The true secret to the burgeoning influence of this New England lay not in the strength of its armies, but in the elasticity of its culture. Having been forced to survive the total upheaval of the Norman Conquest, the people had developed a form of cultural adaptability that was unmatched elsewhere in Europe. They had learned to take the systems imposed upon them, the Norman law, the Roman Church's administration, the French linguistic influence, and bend them until they fit the English reality. Now, as they looked outward, they applied this same principle to the wider world. When they encountered the sophisticated architecture of the continent, they didn't just copy it, they fused it with their own sturdy, practical building traditions to create something uniquely English Gothic, lighter, more vertical, yet anchored by the heavy, reliable stone of the past. When they engaged with the burgeoning legal scholars of Europe, they filtered those complex theories through the practical, customary lens of their own manor courts, producing a legal system that was surprisingly functional and grounded. This was a culture that had stopped fearing the other. For generations, the other had been the conqueror, the intruder, the oppressor, but now that dynamic had flipped. Foreign ideas were no longer threats to be resisted, they were resources to be integrated. This shift in mindset acted as a catalyst for innovation. The English started to become master synthesizers, absorbing influences from the Mediterranean, the Nordic lands, and the heart of Europe, then refining them into something that felt distinctly their own. It was a period of intense intellectual and material cross-pollination. Merchants brought back not just goods, but new methods of bookkeeping and trade. Clerics returned from the great universities of Paris and Bologna with new ways of thinking about faith and governance. Even the nobility, once obsessed with preserving their pure Norman heritage, began to pride themselves on their ability to command an English landscape that was increasingly cosmopolitan. This adaptability was the hallmark of a nation that had moved beyond mere survival. They weren't just reacting to the world, they were actively curating their place within it. By transforming their culture into a permeable, evolving entity, they ensured that it would never stagnate. The England of the late 12th century was a laboratory of synthesis, constantly testing, modifying and incorporating the best of what it encountered. This was the strength that would eventually underpin the nation's later global reach. They had realized that the world was not a series of walls to be defended, but a vast network of ideas to be navigated. In learning to adapt, they had secured their relevance. In learning to synthesize, they had guaranteed their longevity. As the 12th century began to draw to a close, a quiet intellectual revolution was taking root in the English soil. The era of the sword as the only authority was waning, replaced by the realization that knowledge was the true currency of lasting power. This was not the academic theoretical learning of the distant universities, but a practical, grounded knowledge that was essential for the survival and growth of the new English state. Monasteries and cathedral schools, once seen as mere spiritual outposts, transformed into centres of record-keeping, law and agricultural innovation. The monks and clerks who populated these halls became the guardians of a new kind of memory. They were the ones who meticulously charted the shifting boundaries of land, the changing patterns of the weather, and the complexities of the new administrative tax codes. In their scriptoria, they weren't just transcribing religious texts, they were documenting the life of a nation. This systematic recording of reality served as a powerful stabilizing force by pinning down the facts of land ownership, local custom, and social obligation in writing. They created a common truth that protected the ordinary people from the arbitrary whims of distant lords. It was a form of protection. Knowledge became a buffer between the vulnerable and the powerful. Moreover, this period saw the emergence of a more curious, outward-looking English mind. Those who travelled to the continent, merchants, envoys, and scholars, brought back not just goods, but stories and ideas. They encountered the works of classical antiquity and the advancements of the Islamic world, filtering this new learning through the lens of their own unique English experience. They began to ask questions that went beyond the immediate survival of the village. What is the nature of good governance? What defines the rights of a free man? How does our land relate to the wider kingdoms of Europe? This investment in knowledge was the final piece of the structural foundation for the future nation. By building a society that valued documentation, shared history, and informed decision-making, the English were moving away from the reactive nature of their post-conquest years and toward a proactive, reasoned existence. They were teaching themselves how to be stewards of their own destiny. Knowledge, once the domain of a few elite outsiders, was becoming the bedrock upon which the common people could build their own security and prosperity. It was the ultimate acknowledgement that to navigate a volatile world, you must first understand the ground upon which you stand and the history that flows beneath your feet. By the closing years of the 12th century, a subtle but profound psychological shift had taken hold across the English shires. The people were no longer merely the objects of law, they had become its observers and, increasingly, its interpreters. The widespread availability of written records, the tax rolls, the manorial accounts and the legal charters had stripped the law of its mysterious, untouchable aura. It was no longer a secret kept in the castle, it was something that could be read, cross-referenced and debated. This was the awakening of rights. The English peasantry, long defined by their obligations to the manor, began to articulate their existence in terms of entitlements. They started to cite ancestral custom, not as a vague memory, but as a binding principle that even the local lord was obliged to respect. When a steward attempted to increase a labour demand or seize a piece of common land, the villagers would no longer just offer passive resistance. They would point to the established norms, sometimes even producing ancient documents or sworn testimonies from elders to defend their position. This was not a revolution of swords, but a revolution of logic. It was a realization that if the Lord's authority was based on a charter or a decree, then the people's rights could also be grounded in law. By learning the language of the conqueror's administration, the people were turning that very instrument against the inequalities of the system. They were demanding a rule of law that applied even to those at the top. The significance of this development cannot be overstated. It moved the relationship between the governing and the governed away from pure subjugation toward a framework of mutual obligation. It instilled a sense of dignity that had been deeply suppressed since the arrival of the Normans. The people realized that they had a stake in the kingdom's governance, a stake defined by their history, their labor, and their ongoing persistent claim to the land they worked. This shift set the stage for a new kind of political landscape. The English were becoming a society that demanded accountability. They were beginning to see themselves as citizens with legitimate claims rather than subjects with endless duties. As they walked the fields and gathered in the village squares, they carried with them a new confidence, a belief that their voice mattered and that their rights, however humble, were a valid part of the nation's legal fabric. This awakening was the true legacy of the long, arduous post-Conquest years. It was the birth of the understanding that for a nation to be truly stable, its laws must serve the people just as much as the people serve the land. As the 12th century neared its end, the consciousness of the English people had transcended the boundaries of the manor and the parish. The realization of rights, once a collection of isolated village grievances, began to coalesce into a singular national narrative. The paths that connected the villages, the markets where goods were traded, and the roads that led toward London, all became channels for a growing collective identity. Travellers, pilgrims, and local traders acted as the unofficial messengers of this awakening. They carried stories of how other communities were successfully negotiating with their lords, how they were reclaiming their customary rights, and how they were slowly making their voices heard in the local courts. These were not just reports of success. They were sparks that ignited a similar fire elsewhere. The people began to see that their struggle was not an anomaly, but a shared experience that defined the very essence of living in England. This spread of awareness was the birth of a true national consciousness. It was the moment when the inhabitants of the shires, from the northern plains to the southern coasts, began to perceive themselves as parts of a greater unified whole. They shared a common history of survival, a common tongue that had been forged in the crucible of the conquest, and now a common set of expectations for how they ought to be treated. The Norman elite, once accustomed to dealing with fractured, isolated groups, began to sense this shift. They found that their power was no longer just about controlling the land, it was about managing a population that was becoming increasingly self-aware and interconnected. This was a challenging new reality for them. They could no longer isolate a village to suppress its rebellion. They were now facing a national mood, a tide of expectation that could not be easily turned back. This unified consciousness acted as a shield for the culture. It meant that even when political turmoil erupted, or when kings squabbled over thrones, the underlying society, the English nation itself, remained resilient. It had developed a communal nervous system that allowed it to communicate its values and defend its interests. As the people shared their stories and their growing understanding of their own worth, they were effectively weaving a tapestry of national identity that would define England for centuries to come. The era of the fragmented, conquered population had ended. The era of a unified, self-aware citizenry had begun. As the sun began to set on the 12th century, a fundamental transition occurred. The living memory of the conquest passed from the hands of the survivors into the realm of ancestral legend. For those who had endured the immediate upheaval, 1066 was a raw, visceral trauma. But for their grandchildren and great-grandchildren, it was becoming something else, a defining point of origin, a dark prologue to the story of who they were. The legacy left behind was not found in the grand, static stone of the castles that now stood as familiar landmarks on the horizon. It was found in the quiet, persistent ways in which the next generation carried their own identity forward. They had been raised on stories of the before and the during, stories that taught them the value of their own lineage. They understood, without needing to be told, that they were the inheritors of a dual legacy, the strength of the Norman administration and the unyielding endurance of the English spirit. This legacy was effectively an emotional and cultural anchor. By embedding the events of the last century into their folklore, their music and the very way they farmed their land, the people ensured that no future ruler could ever fully overwrite their history. They had created a narrative of legacy that was resilient, adaptive, and entirely their own. It was a narrative that turned the history of their subjugation into a history of their perseverance. This transition was the final step in the process of healing. A nation that can look back at its darkest moments and see not just defeat, but the seeds of its own maturation, is a nation that has truly come of age. The younger generations were not defined by the scars of the past. They were empowered by the lessons of how those scars had been handled. They inherited a country that was no longer a fractured project of foreign lords, but a cohesive reality shaped by their ancestors' daily refusal to be broken. In this way, the long, difficult shadow of the 11th and 12th centuries was transformed into a foundation of lasting stability. The story of their survival became the bedrock of their collective identity. As they walked across their fields or traded in their markets, they were carrying the weight of their ancestors' endurance, turning that weight into the forward momentum of a nation that was finally, unequivocally itself. The conquest was no longer an ending, it was the start of an epic that belonged only to them. As the 13th century loomed on the horizon, the most potent claim the English people had asserted was not for land or coin, but for the right to be judged by their own customs. The foreign legal structures imposed by the conqueror, designed to consolidate centralized control, were gradually being softened by the resilient weight of English precedent. The manor courts, the most local level of justice, had become the primary battleground where the new law met the old way. The stewards and bailiffs, who were increasingly of local origin or deeply integrated into the village life, found themselves in a unique position. To keep the peace and ensure the productivity of the land, they could not simply dictate the law from above. They had to listen to the testimony of the community. When a dispute arose over a boundary line, a theft, or a breach of labour, the resolution was increasingly sought in the memory of the village. If the elders agreed that this is how we have done it for generations, that consensus often outweighed a rigid interpretation of a Norman decree. This was the birth of a nascent legal sovereignty. The English people were transforming the very system meant to subjugate them into a vehicle for their own local governance. They were creating a body of case law that was rooted in the reality of their daily struggles. This was not a formal revolution, but a pragmatic, incremental reclamation of authority. They were proving that law is most effective when it reflects the lived experience of those it governs rather than the abstract mandate of a distant throne. This development fundamentally changed the power dynamic of the kingdom. It signalled to the Norman nobility that their hold on the English populace was no longer absent. The stability of the realm now depended on a form of consent. If the people felt the law was unjust, they would find ways to circumvent it or resist it through the very mechanisms the law provided. This was the first faint echo of the principle that justice should be a shared responsibility rather than a unilateral imposition. As they sat in their local courts, debating the nuances of property and behaviour, the English were doing far more than settling individual disputes. They were training themselves in the art of self-regulation. They were forging a framework where individual rights and communal obligations could coexist. This jurisdictional autonomy was a quiet, profound act of defiance. It was a clear declaration that while they might live under a crown, they remained the masters of their own justice. The foundation for what would eventually be known as common law was being laid not in the halls of Westminster, but in the muddy makeshift courtrooms of the English countryside, built upon the patient memory and stubborn resolve of the ordinary man. The transition toward true national strength required more than just legal precedents. It required the power to control one's own harvest. By the end of the 12th century, the English agrarian landscape had undergone a quiet transformation. While the legal title to the land remained with the Norman lords, the actual management of the agricultural cycle had largely shifted back into the hands of the local English cooperatives. This was a shift from passive labour to active management. The villagers, operating under their own internal structures, began to optimise their crop rotations, manage communal herds, and implement local irrigation and drainage projects that were tailored to the specific quirks of their own soil. They were no longer just labourers following commands, they were stewards of their own economic survival. By producing a surplus that was not immediately seized or accounted for by the Lord's bailiff, they began to create a hidden economy, a small but vital store of wealth that belonged to the community. This economic autonomy provided a buffer against the volatility of the Norman regime. If a lord demanded too much in taxes or labour, the community now had the collective leverage to negotiate, delay, or shift production in ways that protected their core interests. They learned that control of the food supply was, in many ways, the ultimate form of political power. The lords might own the land, but the people owned the means of production, and this gave them a silent, pervasive authority that could not be easily ignored. Furthermore, this economic self-sufficiency fueled the growth of local markets. The surplus crops and handmade goods from the villages began to travel along the roads, connecting one shire to another. These markets became the nervous system of the English economy, fostering an exchange of goods and information that bypassed the feudal structures entirely. It was in these marketplaces that the true wealth of the nation was being generated, not by the gold in the castle coffers, but by the daily meticulous commerce of the common people. This was the final economic building block of an independent England. By becoming self-sufficient, the English people had made themselves less dependent on the whims of their masters. They had turned the agrarian landscape into a fortress of economic stability, ensuring that even in times of political upheaval, the heart of the nation, the village, would keep beating. Their ability to feed themselves, to trade among themselves, and to manage their own resources was the bedrock upon which the future prosperity of the nation would be built. They had moved from survival to endurance, and finally to a state of quiet, unshakable self-reliance. We have travelled a long, arduous road from the fires of Hastings to the bustling marketplaces of the dawn of the 13th century. What began as a narrative of a shattered nation, torn apart by the violent collision of two distinct worlds, has evolved into a story of profound, almost miraculous synthesis. The Norman Conquest, once a symbol of ending and erasure, has revealed itself to be a crucible, a site of intense, transformative pressure that forced a new reality into being. This journey has shown us that identity is not a static artifact inherited from our ancestors. It is a living, breathing project, constantly negotiated and redefined by the people who live upon the land. The English identity that emerged from these 2 centuries was not purely Norman, nor was it purely Anglo-Saxon. It was something entirely new, a hybrid, resilient and adaptive culture that drew its strength from the very collision that had once threatened to destroy it. We look back now at the common men and women who stood at the centre of this transformation. They were the ones who refused to be silenced, the ones who preserved their customs in the quiet of their village life, and the ones who strategically adopted the tools of their rulers to safeguard their own future. They were the true architects of England, an architecture built not of stone and mortar, but of endurance, language, and the relentless, quiet work of living. Today, the story of 1066 and its aftermath serves as a timeless testament to human resilience. It reminds us that no matter how drastically a society is altered from above, the foundation, the collective soul and memory of the people will always find a way to reassert itself. England, as it stood at the dawn of the 13th century, was a testament to the fact that power can be conquered, but culture is forged in the fire of shared experience. The shadows of the conquest have finally lifted, leaving behind a nation that is both scarred and whole, defiant and capable. The legacy of those years is not a history of defeat, but a history of victory, a victory of continuity, of adaptation, and of the unwavering belief that a people who share a common language, a common law, and a common memory can navigate any storm. As the chronicle of this era closes, we leave behind the fractured, fearful people of the past, and witness the birth of a nation that is ready to step out of the shadows and into its own future. The story of their journey is now our own, a reminder that we too are the products of the collisions we have survived and the synthesis we have managed to create. Sleepy History with Kevin is created for relaxation, entertainment, and sleep purposes. The stories shared on this channel are inspired by historical events, daily life, and real periods in history, but they may be simplified, adapted, or narrated in a calming way to enhance the listening experience. This content is not intended to be a precise academic or educational source. While we aim to stay generally accurate, some details may be altered for storytelling flow and relaxation. Please do not rely on this channel as a primary source for historical research or study. By listening, you acknowledge that this content is designed to help you unwind, relax, and fall asleep. Thank you for your understanding and support.